The distress signal had been repeating for 16 days when Elena Vasquez finally caught it on her scanner. She sat alone in the cockpit of her freighter, a beaten old ship called the Moth, and she listened to the message play over and over again, in a language her translator struggled to decode. The voice was high and desperate, and it spoke of darkness and cold and something that sounded very much like terror. Elena pulled up the star charts and found the source of the signal coming from a small colony world called Velro 7 in a system she had never visited before. The planet sat in orbit around twin suns, and according to her records, it had been settled 3 years ago by a species called the Kirathi. She had heard of them before, but never met one in person. They were supposed to look something like the dogs of old Earth, walking upright on bent legs with gray fur and large golden eyes that glowed in low light. A young species, her file said, only 300 years into space travel, and still learning how to survive beyond their home world. The signal kept playing, and Elena made her choice without much thought at all. She changed course and pushed the Moth as hard as the old engines would allow. It took her 3 weeks to reach Velro 7, and when she finally dropped out of faster-than-light travel, she understood immediately why the Kirathi were so afraid. The planet floated in absolute darkness. A massive cloud of cosmic dust had drifted between Velro 7 and its twin suns, blocking out all natural light and casting the entire world into a night that had no end. Elena checked her sensors and saw that the temperature on the surface had dropped far below freezing. The crops would be dead by now, and the Kirathi would be surviving on whatever supplies they had stored before the darkness came. She brought the Moth down through the black sky and landed near the colony's main settlement. Her exterior lights cut through the darkness like knives, and she could see buildings covered in frost and streets empty of any movement. The whole place looked like a ghost town frozen in time. Elena pulled on her heavy coat and grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the frozen ground. The cold hit her face like a slap, and her breath turned to fog in the air. But she had grown up on Europa Station, where the ice never melted, and the cold was simply a fact of life. This was nothing she could not handle. She walked toward the largest building in the settlement, following the faint glow of emergency lights that flickered behind frosted windows. When she reached the main door, she found it unlocked, and she pushed it open and stepped inside. The sight that greeted her made her heart twist in her chest. 200 Kirathi were packed into the central hall of the building, huddled together in groups with their arms wrapped around each other and their ears pressed flat against their skulls. The adults were shaking and the pups were crying, and everyone was staring at the windows where the darkness pressed against the glass like a living thing trying to get in. Elena had seen fear before in many forms on many worlds, but she had never seen anything quite like this. These people were not just scared of the cold or worried about their supplies running low. They were terrified in a way that went deeper than logic, deeper than reason, all the way down to something ancient and primal that lived in the oldest parts of their brains. They were prey animals staring into the dark and waiting for the predator to strike. One of the Kirathi noticed her standing in the doorway and let out a sharp bark of surprise. Heads turned toward her and golden eyes widened at the sight of this strange creature that had walked in from the night. Elena held up her hands to show she meant no harm, and she spoke slowly so her translator could keep up. "I heard your signal," she said. "I came to help." An older Kirathi male pushed his way through the crowd toward her. His fur was silver with age, and his eyes held a weariness that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "You are human," he said, and his voice was rough with exhaustion. "I am," Elena replied. "My name is Elena Vasquez, and I captain a freighter called the Moth." The old Kirathi studied her for a long moment, and then he lowered his ears in a gesture she did not quite understand. "I am Tarek," he said. "I lead what remains of this colony's council." "What happened here?" Elena asked. Though she already knew the answer, Tarek gestured toward the windows and the endless black beyond. The darkness came 8 months ago, he said. We thought it would pass in weeks, but it did not pass, and now our people cannot function. He paused, and his tail tucked between his legs in what looked like shame. We are a diurnal species. He continued. We evolved to hunt in the light and hide when the night came, because the night belonged to the predators who fed on our ancestors. He looked at the huddled masses of his people, and his voice dropped to barely a whisper. We have power and we have food enough to last another month, but none of that matters because our people cannot move and they cannot think, and they cannot do anything but wait for a dawn that never comes. Elena looked at the Kirathi, and she understood something important in that moment. These people were not weak, and they were not cowards. They were fighting against millions of years of evolution that told them to freeze and hide when the darkness fell. Their fear was not a choice, but a chain wrapped around their minds, and no amount of technology or logic could break it. But Elena was human, and humans had faced the dark before. Her ancestors had crawled out of caves and stood on the plains of ancient Earth, and they had looked up at the night sky full of unknown terrors, and they had made a choice that changed everything. They had decided that the darkness was not something to hide from, but something to push back against. Elena turned to Torek, and she smiled in a way that seemed almost out of place in this hall full of fear. All right, she said, cracking her knuckles with a sound that made several nearby Kirathi flinch. Let me show you what my species does when the night gets too long. She walked back toward the door and stepped out into the frozen darkness without hesitation. The Kirathi watched her go with wide eyes and trembling bodies. They did not understand what one human could possibly do against a night that has swallowed their entire world. But they would learn. They would learn very soon. Elena returned to the hall, carrying an armful of broken wood from the collapsed agricultural domes outside. The Kirathi watched her with confusion as she cleared a space in the center of the room and began stacking the wood in a careful pattern. Torek approached her slowly, his golden eyes fixed on the strange pile she was building. What are you doing? He asked. Elena did not answer right away and instead pulled a small device from her pocket and aimed it at the wood. A spark jumped from the device and caught on the dry material, and within moments a small flame began to grow. The fire spread through the stack of wood and rose up into the air, casting dancing shadows across the walls and filling the hall with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. The Kirathi nearest to the flame scrambled backward in alarm, but then something strange happened. They stopped retreating. The pups were the first to notice it, their wide eyes reflecting the orange glow of the flames. One of them, a small gray female with oversized ears, took a hesitant step toward the fire. Her mother reached out to pull her back, but the pup resisted and took another step and then another. She sat down near the flames and stared into them with an expression that slowly changed from fear to wonder. Other pups began to follow her lead, creeping toward the fire like it was calling to them in a voice only they could hear. The adults watched in stunned silence as their children gathered around the burning wood, their trembling bodies growing still for the first time in months. Torek looked at Elena with an expression she could not quite read. We have heating systems, he said slowly. This is not necessary for warmth. Elena sat back and watched the flames dance. This is not about warmth, she said. This is about something older. She gestured for Torek to sit beside her, and after a moment of hesitation, he did. Your ancestors feared the dark, Elena said. So did mine. But somewhere along the way my species figured out that fire was the answer to that fear. She picked up a stick and poked at the flames, sending sparks spiraling up toward the ceiling. Fire pushes back the shadows, she continued. It creates a circle of light where you can see what is coming and nothing can sneak up on you. She looked at the pups gathered around the flames, their tails beginning to wag in slow, uncertain movements. But more than that, Elena said, fire is a promise. A promise that says someone is awake and someone is watching, and the night cannot have you while the flames still burn. Torek was quiet for a long time, and then he spoke in a voice thick with emotion. We have been so afraid, he said. We could not think, and we could not act, and we could only sit and wait for the darkness to take us. He looked at his people, at the pups who were now lying near the fire with their eyes half closed in something that looked almost like peace. We felt shame for our fear, he admitted. We told ourselves that we were a species of technology and reason, and we should be able to overcome such a primitive weakness. Elena shook her head. Fear is not weakness, she said. Fear kept your ancestors alive long enough to become you, and you should not be ashamed of something that saved your species. She stood up and stretched her back. But fear is also a problem that needs solving, she said. And solving problems is what humans do. Over the next several hours, Elena worked without rest. She made trips back and forth to the moth, hauling equipment through the frozen darkness while the Karethi watched from the windows with amazement. She brought portable generators and industrial lights and heating elements and tools of every kind. But she also brought more wood, and she taught the Karethi how to build their own fires. The machines will keep you alive, she told them. But the fire will keep you sane. She showed them how to stack the wood so the flames would burn long and steady. She showed them how to feed the fire without smothering it. She showed them how to sit in a circle around the flames and watch the darkness retreat to the edges of the light. The Karethi learned quickly because the fire spoke to something deep inside them, something older than language or thought. They had been prey animals once, and prey animals knew the value of a safe place in the night. By the time Elena finally stopped to rest, the central hall had been transformed. The single fire in the center had grown into a proper hearth with stones arranged around it to contain the flames. More fires burned in metal containers along the walls, casting warm light into every corner of the room. The Karethi were still afraid, but the terror had faded into something more manageable. More like caution than paralysis. Torek found Elena sitting near the main fire with her back against the wall and her eyes half closed. You should sleep, he said. Soon, she replied. First, I want to make sure the fires will last through the night. Torek sat down beside her and was quiet for a moment. Why did you come here? He asked finally. You heard a distress signal from a species you had never met on a world you had never visited, and you changed your course and flew for 3 weeks to reach us. He turned to look at her with those golden eyes. Why? Elena stared into the flames and thought about the question. Because you were scared, she said at last. And you were alone and the darkness was winning. She smiled a tired smile. And because my mother once told me that the only thing worse than being afraid is being afraid with no one to sit beside you. Torek did not respond with words, but instead he did. Something that surprised Elena deeply. He leaned against her shoulder and let out a long, slow breath, and his tail began to wag in that same uncertain rhythm she had seen in the pups. Thank you, he said quietly. Thank you for bringing us fire. Elena said nothing, but she did not move away either. She sat there in the light of the flames with an alien pressed against her side. And she watched the darkness beyond the windows, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Days turned into weeks, and the darkness did not lift. The dust cloud that blocked the twin suns showed no signs of moving, and the colony of Velro 7 remained trapped in its endless night. But something had changed. Inside the settlement, the Karethi were moving again. Elena had established a system of lights that connected all the buildings in the colony. strings of bright lamps that turned the dark streets into glowing pathways. She had set up watch schedules so that someone was always awake, always tending the fires, always proving that the night could be held at bay. The fear had not disappeared, but it had been pushed back to the fang de the dias edges where it could be managed and controlled. The pups were the ones who adapted fastest, as Elena had expected they would. Young minds were flexible in ways that older minds were not, and the pups quickly learned to see the darkness not as a monster, but as a challenge to be faced. One pup in particular had attached herself to Elena like a shadow. Her name was Kira, and she was 12 years old with gray fur that was slightly darker than most of the others and ears that seemed too big for her head. She followed Elena everywhere, watching everything the human did with wide, curious eyes. "Why do you go out there?" Kira asked one night as Elena prepared for another supply run into the dark. "Because things need to be done," Elena replied. "And the dark does not stop things from needing to be done." Kira tilted her head in that way the Kirithi had when they were thinking hard about something. "But you are afraid too," she said. "I can smell it on you." Elena paused in her preparations and looked at the young pup. "Yes," she admitted. "I am afraid." "Then why do you still go?" Elena knelt down so she was at eye level with Kira. "Because fear is not the same as danger," she said. "Fear is just your brain trying to keep you safe. But sometimes your brain is wrong about what is actually dangerous." She gestured toward the window and the darkness beyond. "The dark out there is cold, and it is empty, but there is nothing in it that wants to hurt me. So I tell my fear to be quiet, and I go do what needs to be done." Kira was silent for a moment, and then she stood up straighter, and her ears came forward. "Can I come with you?" she asked. Elena hesitated, and she could see the pup's mother watching from across the room with worried eyes, but she could also see something else in Kira's face. A need to prove that she could be brave like the human. "Ask your mother," Elena said. Kira ran to her mother, and there was a quick conversation in the Kirathi language that Elena's translator struggled to follow. The mother looked at Elena for a long moment, and then she nodded once with her ears pressed back in obvious fear. Kira returned with her tail wagging so hard her whole body shook. She said, "Yes," the pup announced. Elena smiled and handed Kira a colas small flashlight. "Stay close to me," she said. "And if you get too scared, we turn back immediately with no shame." "Agreed." "Agreed," Kira said, gripping the flashlight like it was a weapon. They stepped out into the darkness together. The cold wrapped around them instantly, and Kira pressed close to Elena's leg, her breath coming in quick, frightened gasps. But she did not run, and she did not freeze. Elena moved slowly, giving the pup time to adjust. And she talked as they walked. "Do you know why humans are so good at handling the dark?" she asked. "Because you are brave," Kira said. "No," Elena replied. "Because we are stubborn." She laughed at the confused look on Kira's face. "A long time ago," Elena explained, "my ancestors lived on a world much like yours, with nights that were full of predators who wanted to eat them." They reached the supply shed, and Elena began loading her arms with boxes while Kira held the flashlight steady. But instead of hiding from the night like sensible creatures, Elena continued, "My ancestors decided they were going to claim it. So they invented fire, and they invented weapons, and they went out into the darkness, and they fought back." She grinned down at the pup. "We were too stubborn to let the night beat us," she said. "And eventually, the night just gave up and let us win." Kira thought about this as they walked back toward the main hall. "So being stubborn is better than being brave?" she asked. "Being stubborn means you keep going even when being brave gets too hard," Elena said. "Bravery runs out, but stubbornness can last forever." When they returned to the hall, Kira's mother rushed to meet them. She scooped up her daughter and held her tight. checking her all over for injuries. But Kira was not injured, and she was not even shaking anymore. I went outside, she announced to everyone who would listen. I went into the dark, and I came back, and it was not so bad. Other pups gathered around her, their eyes wide with admiration. Kira stood taller than Elena had ever seen her stand, and she began telling the story of her adventure, making it sound far more dangerous and exciting than it had actually been. Elena watched from across the room and felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fires. Torek appeared beside her. "You are changing them," he said quietly. "The pups are learning from you, and they are teaching their parents. And soon we will be a different people than we were before. Is that a bad thing?" Elena asked. Tarek was silent for a long moment. "I do not know," he admitted. "We have always been a cautious species, and our fear has kept us safe for thousands of years." He watched Kira entertaining the other pups with her tale of bravery. "But perhaps there is another way to be safe," he said slowly. "Perhaps there is strength in facing fear instead of fleeing from it." Elena put her hand on his shoulder. "Your people are not becoming less Kirathi," she said. "They are becoming more, and fear will always be part of you, but now you know it does not have to control you." Torek nodded slowly, and his tail began its uncertain wag. "You are a strange species," he said. "So I have been told," Elena replied with a smile. The alarm on the moth woke Elena from a dreamless sleep. She sat up in her small cabin aboard the ship and stared at the flashing red light on the control panel with a sinking feeling in her stomach. She already knew what the alarm meant before she even checked the readout. The main reactor was failing. Elena pulled herself out of bed and made her way to the engine room, where she spent the next 3 hours running every diagnostic she knew. The results were not good. She had been pushing the old freighter too hard for too long, drawing power from its systems to run the expanded light grid that now covered the entire settlement. The reactor had never been designed for this kind of sustained output, and now it was paying the price. She had maybe 2 weeks before the whole thing shut down completely. Elena sat on the cold floor of the engine room and stared at the damaged reactor and thought about her options. Option 1 was to stop feeding power to the settlement and let the moth's systems recover. But that would mean shutting down most of the lights, and the Kirathi were not ready for that yet. Option 2 was to begin evacuation, loading the Kirathi onto the moth and leaving Valro 7 behind. The ship could handle the passengers if she pushed it, and there were friendly ports within range where the refugees could be resettled. Option 3 was to cannibalize the moth's non-essential systems to keep the reactor running longer. This would save the settlement, but it would also strand Elena on Valor 7 with no way to leave. She thought about it for a long time. She thought about her life before she had come to this frozen world. The endless years of hauling cargo from one port to another with nothing to show for it but an empty ship and an emptier heart. She thought about the Kirathi and the progress they had made, and the pups who now ran through the lighted streets without fear. She thought about Kira and the pride in the young ones' eyes when she returned from the darkness. The choice was not really a choice at all. Elena began pulling apart her navigation array. She was halfway through the work when Torek found her. The old Kirathi stood in the doorway of the engine room and watched her work with a growing expression of alarm. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Repairs," Elena said without looking up. Tarek stepped closer and examined the components she had removed. "These are not damaged," he said slowly. "You are not repairing them. You are removing them." Elena sighed and sat back on her heels. "The reactor is failing," she admitted. "I have been taking too much power for too long, and now it needs parts that I do not have. She gestured to the pile of components beside her. But I do have these. And with some creative engineering, I can convert them into replacement parts that will keep the reactor running for at least another 6 months. Torek's ears flattened against his skull. But these are navigation components, he said. Without them, your ship cannot fly. I know. The word hung in the air between them. Torek stared at her for a long moment, and then he turned and left without another word. Elena watched him go, and then she returned to her work. An hour later, she heard footsteps approaching, and she looked up expecting to see Torek again. Instead, she found the entire Kirathi Council standing in the engine room doorway. There were 7 of them in total, the eldest and wisest members of the colony, and they all wore the same expression of troubled determination. Torek stepped forward to speak for the group. We have discussed the situation, he said, and we have reached a decision. Elena set down her tools and stood up. We will evacuate, Torek continued. You have given us enough, and we cannot ask you to sacrifice your ship and your freedom for our sake. I have not asked for your opinion, Elena said. Torek's ears twitched in surprise. Captain Vasquez, this is our colony and our decision to make. And this is my ship and my decision to make, Elena replied. I am not asking you to approve of what I am doing. I am simply doing it. An older female with white streaked furs stepped forward. You would strand yourself here forever, she asked. For people you only met 4 months ago. Elena looked at her and then at the rest of the council. I have been flying freight for 20 years, she said. I have visited hundreds of worlds and helped thousands of people. And do you know what I have to show for it? She spread her hands. Nothing, she said. I drop off supplies and I move on, and the next crisis hits, and nobody remembers I was ever there. She turned back to the damaged reactor. But this is different, she said. Here I am building something that will last. And when you tell your grandchildren about the long dark, they will remember that a human stayed when she could have run. She picked up her tools and began working again. That matters to me more than a functioning ship ever could. The council was silent. Then Torek did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He walked forward and picked up a component from the pile and held it out to Elena. Show me what to do, he said. Elena looked at him and saw something new in his golden eyes, something that looked like respect and gratitude, and maybe even love. She took the component from his hands and began to explain one by one. The other council members joined them. They were not engineers, and they did not understand most of what Elena was doing, but they handed her tools when she asked, and they held components in place while she worked, and they kept her company through the long hours of labor. By the time the sun should have risen, if there had been a sun to rise, the repairs were complete. The reactor hummed with new life, and Elena's ship sat silent and grounded forever. She stood outside the moth and looked at it for a long time. It had been her home for 15 years, and now it was nothing more than a metal shell filled with memories. Torek stood beside her. You are one of us now, he said quietly, whether you wanted to be or not. Elena laughed, and it was a strange sound full of both sadness and joy. I have been one of you since the moment I walked through that door and saw your people huddled in the dark, she said. She turned away from the ship and looked toward the settlement, where lights still burned in every window. Now come on, she said. Those fires are not going to tend themselves. Day 847 began like every other day had begun since Elena arrived on Varo 7. She woke in her small room in the main hall, and she checked the fire that burned in the corner, and she dressed in layers against the cold that never seemed to fade. But when she stepped outside, something was different. The darkness was not quite as dark as it had been the day before. Elena stood in the street and stared up at the sky, where a faint glow was beginning to spread across the eastern horizon. Her heart began to beat faster. She ran to the observation post that the Kirathi had built on the highest point of the settlement. Climbing the ladder so fast she nearly slipped twice from the top, she could see it clearly. The dust cloud was thinning. Light was breaking through. She grabbed the communication device and shouted into it with a voice that cracked with emotion. "Everyone wake up. Get outside. The suns are coming back." Within minutes, the streets were filled with Kirathi. They poured out of every building. Adults and pups and elders, all of them staring up at the sky with wide, disbelieving eyes. The glow on the horizon grew brighter and brighter until it hurt to look at directly, and then the first ray of true sunlight broke through the dust and struck the frozen surface of Varo 7 like a spear of gold. The Kirathi began to howl. It was not a sound of fear or pain, but something much older. A cry of joy and triumph that their ancestors had made when the long nights of their homeworld finally ended. The sound rose up into the brightening sky and echoed across the frozen plains, and Elena felt tears streaming down her face, though she could not have said exactly why. Kira found her in the crowd and grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the center of the settlement, where the largest fire still burned. "Look," the young one said, pointing at the flames. Even in the growing daylight, the fire burned bright and strong. The Kirathi had gathered around it as they always did, but this time they were not huddling for comfort. They were standing tall with their ears up and their tails wagging and their eyes full of a pride that Elena had never seen in them before. Torek climbed onto a raised platform near the fire and raised his arms for silence. The howling faded and 200 Kirathi turned to look at their leader. "We have survived," Torek said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "We have faced the longest night in our history, and we have not broken." He looked at Elena where she stood, with Kira at the edge of the gathering. "We did not survive alone," he continued. "A stranger came to us when we were lost in fear, and she showed us how to fight back against the darkness." He gestured toward the fires that still burned throughout the settlement, toward the lights that still glowed in every window, toward the infrastructure that had been built during the long dark. "She taught us that fire is more than heat and light," Torek said. "Fire is defiance. Fire is a promise that says we will not go quietly into the night." The Kirathi began to murmur in agreement. "And when she could have left us," Torek went on, "when she could have saved her ship and returned to her own people, she chose to stay. She chose us." He stepped down from the platform and walked through the crowd until he stood directly in front of Elena. "The council has met," he said, "and we have voted unanimously." He reached out and took Elena's hands in his own. "We want you to stay," he said, "not as a guest or a visitor, but as family, as one of us, as a Kirathi in all the ways that matter." Elena looked at him and then at the crowd of faces watching her. Golden eyes and gray fur and wagging tails. She looked at Kira, who was practically vibrating with excitement. She looked at the fire still burning, even though the suns had returned. Kept alive now, not out of necessity, but out of tradition and memory and love. "You know," Elena said slowly, "I have been running my whole life from one port to the next, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots." She squeezed Tarek's hands. "I think maybe it is time to stop running." The cheer that went up from the Kirathi was loud enough to echo off the mountains in the distance. Kira slammed into Elena's legs with enough force to nearly knock her over, wrapping her arms around the human and burying her face in Elena's coat. "I knew you would stay," the pup said, her voice muffled by fabric. "I knew it from the first day." Elena laughed and ruffled the fur between Kira's ears. "You are too smart for your own good," she said. The celebration lasted for hours as the twin suns climbed higher in the sky and the temperature began to rise for the first time in over 2 years. The Kirathi danced and sang and howled and feasted on food that had been rationed for so long that everyone had forgotten what a full meal tasted like, and through it all the fires kept burning. They would burn for years afterward. Maintained by volunteers who took shifts day and night, some visitors from other worlds would ask why the Kirithi kept fires burning when they had heating systems and electricity and all the technology they could ever need. The Kirithi would smile at this question, and they would tell the story of the long dark and the human who came with flames in her hands. They would tell of Elena Vasquez, who flew for 3 weeks to answer a distress signal from strangers. They would tell of how she taught a species of prey animals to be brave. They would tell of how she sacrificed her ship and her freedom to give them light in the darkness. And they would tell of how she stayed across the galaxy. The story spread in the years that followed. Other species heard it, and they wondered at these strange humans who seemed incapable of leaving well enough alone. The Kirithi had been afraid of the night like so many species before them, but the human had not run from their fear or dismissed it as weakness. She had answered it with the oldest weapon her species possessed. The pups had feared the night. The human lit a fire, and she stayed. In the end, that was what humans did. They stayed. They stayed when it was hard and when it was dangerous. And when every sensible voice told them to run, they stayed, because staying was the only answer to fear that actually worked. And on Velro 7, in a small settlement that had once been frozen in terror, a human woman lived out the rest of her days surrounded by a family she had chosen and who had chosen her. She tended fires and raised pups and taught generations of young Kirithi that the darkness was not something to flee, but something to face when she finally passed. Old and gray and content, the Kirithi built her a monument in the center of the settlement. It was a great stone hearth that burned with a flame that never went out. And on the base, they carved words in both Kirithi and human languages. She brought us fire and she stayed. And the fire burned on.